The scent of black walnut and cedar filled the air, a familiar incense that clung to Jack Miller's clothes and skin. In his rented garage workshop in Queens, this was his sanctuary, a cathedral of sawdust and honest labor. The single incandescent bulb cast dancing shadows across the stacks of raw lumber as his hands, thick with calluses, moved with a surgeon's precision over a plank of cherry wood. He wasn't just measuring, he was listening to the wood, understanding its soul before the first cut. This was his language, integrity spoken through dovetail joints. At $55,000 a year, his income was modest, but it was earned with a satisfaction more substantial than any bank statement. He believed in value built by time, a philosophy losing currency in the world his wife, Eleanor, was desperate to join. The rhythmic scrape of his block plane was meditative, but lately it couldn't drown out the dissonant chord of doubt in his chest. He could almost smell her sharp, expensive perfume in the workspace, a scent that seemed to disapprove of the honest aroma of work. He paused, hand resting on the cool wood, and the silence rushed in, filled with the unspoken distance growing between them like an invasive weed. He feared he wasn't just sanding wood anymore. He was trying to smooth over a marriage splintering from the inside out. Their expensive one-bedroom apartment felt less like a home and more like a stage for Eleanor's ambitions. Every surface was a curated vignette for her Instagram feed, a life projected but not lived. His worn leather armchair was constantly shunted into a corner, replaced by sterile, trendy pieces she bought on credit. As a junior assistant at a high-end Manhattan real estate brokerage, she wore her title like a designer coat against the cold reality of her middling salary. She spoke of her clients' penthouses with a proprietary air, as if their wealth could be absorbed through osmosis. To her, Jack was no longer a partner. He was a stagnant project, a piece of rustic furniture that clashed with her minimalist aesthetic. He saw it in the curl of her lip when he came home smelling of sawdust. The air in the apartment was thick with her unspoken disappointment. He felt like a ghost in his own home, a relic she was actively trying to erase. He was starting to realize she wasn't just curating a feed, she was curating a new life, and he was the element she was eager to edit out. If you enjoy stories of karma, hidden secrets, and the quiet power of the underestimated, subscribe now to witness how the truth always finds a way to surface. The most painful battleground was the marital bed. It was a magnificent, king-sized piece he had crafted from a single slab of black walnut for their wedding. The headboard was a masterpiece of hand-carved vines, a design that had taken him 200 hours to complete. To Jack, it was the heart of their home. To Eleanor, it was a clunky, rustic monstrosity. Now, his work was buried under a mountain of expensive designer pillows, a fluffy tombstone for his romantic gesture. She spoke constantly of replacing it with a minimalist platform bed she'd seen in Soho, a piece as cold and interchangeable as the apartments she showed clients. The bed had become a metaphor. He saw a foundation of history. She saw an outdated burden. Every night, lying beside her and smelling her expensive night cream, he felt the solid walnut beneath him and the vast, empty space between them. He knew she wasn't just dreaming of a new bed, but of a new man to share it with. 6 months ago, a profound shift had occurred in Jack's life, unnoticed by Eleanor. His grandmother, a shrewd woman who had never trusted Eleanor, passed away. In her will, she bypassed Eleanor completely, leaving her entire estate to Jack, a portfolio of real estate investments valued at $75 million. The crown jewel was a breathtaking penthouse in an ultra-exclusive Tribeca high-rise. The property was held in an irrevocable trust with Jack as the sole beneficiary, a fortress designed to be impervious to a future ex-wife. Eleanor, in her arrogance, had never bothered to ask about the will, dismissing his simple family. The secret of his inheritance felt like a lead weight in his soul, a monumental truth in a marriage built on fragile fictions. He hadn't told her, sensing that this knowledge, in her hands, would become a weapon. The first sign was a discrepancy in their joint checking account, $500 vanishing every single week. When he broached the subject, she dismissed it with a wave of her hand. "It's for my new wardrobe, Jack. I need to look the part. It's an investment." Her smile was bright and brittle. He knew what her clothes cost. This was something else. The money was being siphoned off with a quiet efficiency. He watched her more closely, noticing how she guarded her phone, smiling at texts from her boss, Preston Sterling. She dropped his name like a status symbol. "Preston says the market is on fire." Preston closed a $20 million deal. The name echoed in Jack's mind. He felt a cold dread crystallizing. The missing money wasn't for clothes. It was funding the construction of a new life, and he was the one paying for it. The illusion shattered when Jack was cleaning the glove compartment of their aging sedan. Tucked beneath expired insurance cards, he found a folded printout from a high-end interior design store in Soho. The list was staggering. A $12,000 Italian sofa, $6,000 for lounge chairs. The total was more than he earned in 6 months. But it wasn't the cost that made the blood drain from his face. It was the delivery address. A building in Tribeca so exclusive he'd only seen it in magazines. A cold wave of nausea washed over him. He sat in the driver's seat, the scent of stale coffee filling his lungs. He thought of the $500 a week, how much of his sweat had been funneled into this. He knew, with sickening certainty, that this furniture wasn't for their queen's apartment. It was for a life she was building in secret, a life that reflected the world of Preston Sterling. The drive to his lawyer's office was a blur. Mr. Davies, his grandmother's lawyer, listened patiently as Jack laid out his suspicions. He slid the crumpled printout across the mahogany desk. Davies studied it, then typed the address into his computer. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the frantic thumping of Jack's heart. "Jack," Davies said gently, "the address on this invoice, it's the penthouse. It's your penthouse." The words reconfigured his reality. She wasn't just cheating. She was building her secret life with another man inside the very walls of his own inheritance. The audacity left him breathless. It was a violation so profound that the scent of leather in the office suddenly felt suffocating, replaced by the phantom smell of his wife's tainted perfume. The knowledge was poison. Every meal, every conversation was a masterpiece of pained restraint. He needed proof. A suspicion was not enough. The thought of what he had to do made him feel sick. He was a builder, not a spy. But she left him no choice. He bought a tiny, sophisticated hidden camera concealed in a smoke detector. That evening, while Eleanor was at a work dinner, he went to Tribeca. The penthouse was a silent, cavernous space, smelling of fresh paint. And there, in the center of the living room, was the $12,000 Italian sofa. He walked through the rooms, his boots leaving faint, dusty footprints on the pristine floors. He found the master bedroom, where the sleek platform bed she coveted was already assembled. He felt a visceral, gut-wrenching pain. Trembling, he installed the camera on the ceiling. He left as silently as he came, the heavy door closing with a somber thud, sealing the scene of her future crime. For a week, he couldn't bring himself to look. He tried to lose himself in his work, but his focus was shattered. Finally, late one night while she slept beside him in the walnut bed, he slipped out to his workshop. He logged into the secure server, his hand shaking. He clicked on the file for the previous night. The video was crystal clear. The door opened, and Eleanor walked in, followed by a man, Preston Sterling. Smug, entitled, exactly as Jack had pictured. Eleanor laughed with a joy he hadn't heard in years, throwing her arms around Preston's neck. Jack watched them move through his penthouse, Eleanor showing off the nest she had built with Jack's money. They moved to the bed, and the betrayal was captured in high definition. Jack forced himself to watch. The pain was searing, a white-hot agony, but beneath it, the grief was being forged into a cold, unyielding resolve. He was no longer a victim. He was a witness. He sat in the dark for hours. The shock subsided, replaced by an architect's precision applied to the dismantling of a lie. He saw every flaw in the facade Eleanor had built. He spent the next day with Mr. Davies, drafting the blueprints for her destruction. It wouldn't be enough to divorce her or evict her. He needed to expose her. The centerpiece of his plan was a piece of poetic justice so perfect it was almost cruel. He was going to throw a party. Jack hired a graphic artist to design a digital invitation that screamed wealth and sophistication. Jack and Eleanor Miller request the pleasure of your company to celebrate their wedding anniversary, and a very special housewarming. The address, the Tribeca penthouse. The guest list included everyone, her family, their friends, and crucially, her entire professional network. The board of directors, her clients, and Preston Sterling. He hit send and watched the invitations fly out. Silent ticking time bombs. He imagined her confusion turning to panic, or perhaps arrogance, thinking he had made a grand gesture to win her back. He was counting on that arrogance. It was the fatal flaw he was about to exploit with catastrophic force. The first breath of morning was always the coldest. It wasn't the digitally controlled 68 degrees of the room, but a chill emanating from the very soul of the space they called home. Jack Miller's eyes opened to the pale light of a queen's dawn filtering through sheer linen curtains. He lay perfectly still, avoiding disturbing the empty, crisply turned-down side of the bed. His gaze drifted to the headboard, the one solid truth in the room. He could trace the hand-carved vines with his eyes, a pattern he knew intimately. 200 hours of his life and love were etched into that black walnut. Once a testament to their future, it was now a monument to a forgotten dream, buried under a mountain of beige and greige designer pillows, silent insults to the rich wood beneath. He smelled her on the pillow, not the warm scent of a partner, but the sharp, chemical aroma of expensive anti-aging cream, a fragrance of defense, not intimacy. He swung his legs out, the solid frame a comfort before his feet met the cold, unwelcoming Swedish hardwood floors. The apartment's silence wasn't peaceful. It was a vacuum heavy with resentment. The daily performance was about to begin. He, the inadequate husband. She, the director for an audience of one. He found her in the kitchen, transformed into a sterile white set piece for her social media. Bathed in the blue light of her phone, she composed a shot of her green smoothie next to a perfect orchid. The air was thick with her aggressive floral perfume, scouring away the faint, honest scent of sawdust that clung to him. He cleared his throat, and she turned, scanning him dismissively. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Morning," she said, her voice as cold as marble. She glanced at his wrist as he reached for the coffee maker. Still wearing that thing? The thing was his durable Timex, a gift from his late father. "Preston showed me his new Patek Philippe yesterday. It's an investment, Jack. It signals success." He nodded, pouring water over the grounds, the earthy aroma a small rebellion. He felt the familiar ache of being measured and found wanting. He built value with his hands. She saw only deficiency. His father's watch wasn't a symbol of heritage to her, but a billboard for his failure to grasp the language of money and status. He was a stagnant project. She was the developer itching to tear him down. If you enjoy stories of karma and hidden secrets, subscribe now to witness how the truth always surfaces. The next battleground was the hall closet. Reaching for his coat, a faded tobacco canvas softened by years of wear, he touched an old friend. Its deep pockets held tape measures and memories, its fabric smelling faintly of cedar and linseed oil. "Oh God, Jack, not that coat." Eleanor's voice cut through the air. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed in theatrical disgust. "You look like a construction worker." He was a master craftsman, but the distinction was lost on her. "My colleagues' husbands wear Brioni. You walk out in that thing, and it reflects on me. It's embarrassing." The word hung sharp and poisonous. Embarrassing. Shame flushed his neck, infuriating him. He was proud of his work, but to her, his calloused hands and honest wear were stains on her curated image. He was a smudge on her perfect photo, a piece of clunky furniture clashing with her ambitions. She wasn't just critiquing his wardrobe. She was critiquing his existence. The final, most egregious sin was the backpack. It sat by the door, an old olive-drab canvas rucksack with worn leather straps, a relic from college that hauled his daily essentials: thermos, sandwich, sketchbook. As he bent to pick it up, Eleanor sighed with the weight of pure contempt. "Seriously? The backpack? Jack, you're a grown man. You can't carry that filthy sack like a student." Preston carries a hand-stitched calfskin briefcase. It says, "I am a serious person. I am successful." She wouldn't look at it, treating it like garbage. The unspoken words hung in the air. "You are a failure, and this ugly bag is your badge." He stood there, hand hovering over the strap, feeling the weight of her judgment. The backpack was part of his story, a symbol of purpose. To her, it was just more evidence against him. He said nothing. A familiar concession, but a knot of resentment tightened in his gut. He slung the backpack over his shoulder, its weight a defiant comfort. He didn't look back as he walked out, feeling her laser beam of disapproval. "Have a good day," he mumbled. "Try to," she replied, implying his presence made that impossible. The closing door was a profound relief. In the elevator, the polished steel reflection showed him what she saw: a tired man in a worn coat and old bag, belonging to a less polished world. The subway station was a welcome sensory assault: street food, traffic, life. But her words echoed: embarrassing, stagnant, not serious. It wasn't just about his things anymore. It was a systematic dismantling of his identity, erasing the man he was for a fantasy she constructed. He thought of the missing money, the secretive texts, the late nights. Her contempt felt active, strategic, as if she were clearing a path. Descending into the damp station, a terrible thought coalesced. She wasn't just trying to change him. She was preparing to replace him. The breaking point arrived quietly with the rustle of paper on a Tuesday. In the driver's seat of their 10-year-old sedan, the rust bucket, Eleanor refused to drive. Jack was clearing the glove compartment. The car smelled of stale upholstery and old air freshener. Sifting through expired insurance cards and crumbled receipts, his calloused fingers found a folded piece of paper, crisp and sharp against the worn documents. He unfolded it. It was an invoice from a high-end Soho design store, a place he knew only from Eleanor's magazines. He scanned the list. Sofa, Italian linen, $12,500. Lounge chairs, $6, $800. Chandelier, $8, $200. The numbers blurred, an obscene cascade of expense totaling more than 8 months of his earnings. But it wasn't the cost that made the blood roar in his ears. It was the delivery address printed at the top, a Tribeca high-rise, the pinnacle of the world she craved. He knew with cold certainty that this furniture wasn't for their queen's apartment. The trust he had given her was a sham, and the foundation of their marriage was a hollow shell. The drive to his lawyer's office in Midtown was an out-of-body experience. The familiar gritty landscape of Queens, with its red brick apartment buildings, bustling bodegas, and the comforting roar of the elevated train, seemed to belong to a different man's life. He felt like a ghost piloting a machine through a world that was no longer his. He parked the old sedan 3 blocks away from the lawyer's skyscraper, the car looking like a weary, rusted beetle among the gleaming black Escalades and chauffeured Mercedes that lined the curb. He was acutely aware of his appearance. His worn flannel shirt, his sturdy but scuffed work boots, the fine layer of sawdust that seemed to have permanently settled into the creases of his skin. Ascending 50 floors in a silent express elevator paneled in polished brass, he caught his reflection and saw a stranger, a man whose quiet, simple life had been violently capsized, leaving him adrift in a sea of betrayal. Mr. Davies, his grandmother's lawyer, was a man whose calm gray eyes had witnessed the full spectrum of human greed and folly. His office was a sanctuary of old money and quiet power, smelling of leather-bound books, lemon polish, and the faint, pleasant aroma of a recently smoked cigar. Jack sat in a deep leather chair that sighed under his weight as he recounted his story. His voice was low and steady, a stark contrast to the maelstrom of rage and grief churning inside him. He laid out the evidence with the precision of a carpenter fitting a joint, the steady, weekly drain of $500 from their joint account, Eleanor's increasingly flimsy lies about work expenses, her obsessive talk of Preston Sterling. Finally, he slid the crumpled invoice from the Soho store across the vast, gleaming expanse of the mahogany desk. Davies picked it up, his expression unreadable as he studied the document. He didn't speak for a long, agonizing minute. He simply swiveled in his chair, his movements economical and precise, and typed the Tribeca address into the large monitor on his credenza. The silence in the room was absolute, a crushing weight broken only by the soft, rhythmic clicking of the keyboard and the frantic, panicked drumming of Jack's own heart against his ribs. Davies stopped typing, his eyes fixed on the screen. He turned back to face Jack, his face a mask of professional sympathy, but his words were a guillotine. "Jack," he said, his voice a gentle, devastating blade. "The address on this invoice. It's the penthouse. It's your penthouse." The lawyer's words didn't just hang in the air, they detonated. Your penthouse. The 2 words reconfigured the architecture of his wife's betrayal, twisting it from an affair into a masterpiece of audacious treachery. It was a hostile occupation. She was building her new life inside the sanctuary his grandmother had bequeathed to protect him. The arrogance was physical, knocking the air from his lungs. In that hushed office, the soft, forgiving man he had been died a brutal death. Grief was cauterized by a cold fury. He saw her campaign clearly, dismantling his worth to justify her betrayal. Confrontation was useless. She would lie. He needed undeniable proof. He needed to see it. The thought was bitter, a descent into deceit. He was a builder of honest things. Now, he would become a spy in the ruins of his marriage. The electronics store was a dim space smelling of ozone. Jack felt like a criminal, hunched and avoiding the clerk's eyes. He felt at home in lumberyards, not this clandestine world of surveillance. He examined the devices with self-loathing, finally settling on a smoke detector with a hidden high-definition camera. The cash transaction felt sordid. He was using honest labor to buy the tools of a dishonest world. That evening, he waited until Eleanor left for a strategy dinner, her lie transparent. As the door clicked shut, he grabbed his tools and headed for the subway, a cold stone in his chest. He was about to become a trespasser in his own home to prove a truth he already knew. The penthouse was a silent, echoing cavern. Jack used his key, the expensive lock turning with a deafening snick. The air smelled of fresh paint, a life not yet lived. Moonlight illuminated half-unpacked boxes and the $12,000 Italian sofa, a minimalist wail in the vast room. He walked through the space, his boots leaving dusty footprints on the pristine floors, each step a fresh stab. This was his legacy, colonized by her infidelity. In the master bedroom, larger than his entire apartment, stood the sleek platform bed she had coveted. The sight was a physical punch. Forcing down the pain, he climbed a stepladder and installed the camera, positioning the lens perfectly over the bed. Every precise movement felt like self-desecration. He left silently, the fire door sealing the stage for the final act. For a week, he didn't look. The cloud server was a Pandora's box. He tried to lose himself in his workshop, but his focus was shattered. He was a ghost, haunted by the accumulating data. He noticed Eleanor's extra makeup, the new lingerie, the bold lies delivered with casual confidence. The charade chipped away at his soul. On the 8th night, while she slept beside him in the walnut bed, an obscenity now, he slipped out to the cold garage. He sat at his workbench, laptop balanced on stains of old projects, and logged in. He clicked on the previous night's file. Hesitating, heart hammering, he knew this was the precipice. Pressing play would burn away the man who loved Eleanor Miller forever. The video was brutally clear. The empty bedroom waited in the city glow. Then, Eleanor walked in, followed by Preston Sterling, smug, entitled, exactly as Jack pictured. Eleanor laughed, a genuine sound of joy he hadn't heard in years, and threw her arms around Preston, kissing him with a hunger she no longer showed Jack. The sight collapsed his lungs. He watched them move through his bedroom. Eleanor showing off the nest built with his stolen money. They moved to the bed, and the betrayal was captured in high definition. Jack forced himself to watch every frame. The searing agony superheated and compressed his grief into a cold, unyielding resolve. The video wasn't just proof of infidelity, it was evidence of a larger crime. He sat in the dark workshop for hours. The silence, a tomb. The images were seared into his mind, a loop of betrayal. But shock had subsided into preternatural calm. Grief remained, heavy and aching, but the dominant force was now a cold, methodical anger. He was a builder who understood foundations and load-bearing walls. Eleanor had built a fragile facade, and he saw every flaw. He knew where to strike to bring it down. The video was just the cornerstone. He needed to understand the full scope of her treachery. He crept back into the apartment with a predator's silence. While she slept, he took her laptop to the living room. Guessing her password, the name of a childhood pet, he gained access. He ignored the photos and opened her email with the grim determination of a forensic accountant. The lawyer's words didn't just hang in the air. They detonated. Your penthouse. It was a hostile occupation. She was building her new life with another man inside the very sanctuary his grandmother had bequeathed him. The arrogance was a physical force, knocking the air from his lungs. In that hushed office, the soft, forgiving man he had been died a quiet death. Grief was cauterized by a cold, clarifying fury. He saw her campaign clearly, dismantling his worth to justify her betrayal. Confrontation was useless. She would lie. He needed undeniable proof. He needed to see it. The thought was bitter, a descent into deceit. He was a builder. Now, he would become a spy. The electronics store was a dim space in the West Village smelling of ozone. Jack felt like a criminal, hunched and avoiding the clerk's eyes. He felt at home in lumber yards, not this clandestine world. He examined the devices with self-loathing, finally settling on a smoke detector with a hidden high-definition camera. The cash transaction felt sordid. He was using honest labor to buy the tools of a dishonest world. That evening, he waited until Eleanor left for a strategy dinner, her lie transparent. As the door clicked shut, he grabbed his tools and headed for the subway, a cold stone in his chest. He was about to become a trespasser in his own home. The penthouse was a silent, echoing cavern. Jack used his key, the expensive lock turning with a deafening snick. The air smelled of fresh paint, a life not yet lived. Moonlight illuminated half-unpacked boxes and the $12,000 Italian sofa, a minimalist wail in the vast room. He walked through the space, his boots leaving dusty footprints on the pristine floors, each step a fresh stab. This was his legacy, colonized by her infidelity. In the master bedroom, larger than his entire apartment, stood the sleek platform bed she had coveted. The sight was a physical punch. Forcing down the pane, he climbed a stepladder and installed the camera, positioning the lens perfectly over the bed. Every precise movement felt like self-desecration. He left silently, the fire door sealing the stage for the final act. For a week, he didn't look. The cloud server was a Pandora's box. He tried to lose himself in his workshop, but his focus was shattered. He was a ghost, haunted by the accumulating data. He noticed Eleanor's extra makeup, the new lingerie, the bold lies delivered with casual confidence. The charade chipped away at his soul. On the 8th night, while she slept beside him in the walnut bed, an obscenity now, he slipped out to the cold garage. He sat at his workbench, laptop balanced on stains of old projects, and logged in. He clicked on the previous night's file. Hesitating, heart hammering, he knew this was the precipice. Pressing play would burn away the man who loved Eleanor Miller forever. The video was brutally clear. The empty bedroom waited in the city glow. Then, Eleanor walked in, followed by Preston Sterling. Smug, entitled, exactly as Jack pictured. Eleanor laughed, a genuine sound of joy he hadn't heard in years, and threw her arms around Preston, kissing him with a hunger she no longer showed Jack. The sight collapsed his lungs. He watched them move through his bedroom, Eleanor showing off the nest she had built with his stolen money. They moved to the bed, and the betrayal was captured in high definition. Jack forced himself to watch every frame. The searing agony superheated and compressed his grief into a cold, unyielding resolve. The video wasn't just proof of infidelity, it was evidence of a larger crime. He sat in the dark workshop for hours, the silence a tomb. The images were seared into his mind, a loop of betrayal. But shock had subsided into preternatural calm. Grief remained, heavy and aching. But the dominant force was now a cold, methodical anger. He was a builder who understood foundations. Eleanor had built a fragile facade, and he saw every flaw. He knew where to strike. The video was just the cornerstone. He needed to understand the full scope of her treachery. He crept back into the apartment with a predator's silence. While she slept, he took her laptop to the living room. Guessing her password, the name of a childhood pet, he gained access. He ignored the photos and opened her email with the grim determination of a forensic accountant. While Thorne's legal team began the meticulous process of dissecting Eleanor's digital life, Jack's next move was to fortify his financial defenses. Following another set of instructions from his grandmother's journal, he took a taxi to a discreet, unmarked brownstone on the Upper East Side. There was no sign, no name on the door, only a small, polished brass plaque bearing a single, stylized B. This was the private bank that had managed the Miller family's wealth for 3 generations, a place of silent, old-world power that operated in a universe parallel to the one of ATMs and online banking. The interior was a hushed sanctuary of dark wood paneling, worn Persian rugs, and the faint, pleasant scent of beeswax and old paper. A man in a perfectly tailored gray suit, who looked to be about Jack's age, greeted him by name, his handshake firm and his smile genuine. This was Mr. Albright, the man who had managed his grandmother's portfolio for the last 20 years. They sat not in an office, but in a library, surrounded by leather-bound books, the only sound the soft ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Jack, for the first time, felt a sense of belonging in this world of wealth. It wasn't the ostentatious, brittle world of Eleanor's aspirations. It was a world of quiet stewardship, of value built and protected over time, a philosophy he understood in his very bones. With Albright's quiet, expert guidance, Jack executed a series of maneuvers with a calm, decisive authority that belied his inexperience. He was a quick study, his builder's mind easily grasping the concepts of structure, of load-bearing assets, and of legal firewalls. He signed documents that moved vast sums of money between accounts, diversifying the portfolio and placing the bulk of the liquid assets into newly created subtrusts, each one a separate, impregnable fortress. He was building a financial stronghold, ensuring that when the coming storm hit, not a single penny of his grandmother's legacy would be exposed. The process took 4 hours. 4 hours of signing papers that represented more money than he could have earned in 100 lifetimes of honest labor. As they concluded, Albright looked at him with a deep, paternal respect. "Your grandmother would be very proud of you, Jack. You have her pragmatism." There was one final piece of business. Albright brought up the joint checking account he shared with Eleanor, the one from which she had been siphoning her weekly allowance for betrayal. "Shall we close this account, Mr. Miller, and transfer the remaining funds?" Albright asked. Jack looked at the balance, a paltry few $1,000s, the last vestiges of his own hard-earned money. A cold, thin smile touched his lips for the first time that day. "No," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Leave it open for now. I want her to think she still has access to it." Albright raised an eyebrow but didn't question the command, simply making a note. Jack knew that the account was no longer a vulnerability. It was now a weapon, a piece of irresistible bait left in the center of a perfectly constructed trap. He didn't go back to Queens. The apartment was a contaminated zone, a piece of his past he had already written off. Thorne's firm had arranged a suite for him at a discreet luxury hotel in Soho, a temporary command center for the war he was now orchestrating. The suite was vast and impersonal, all shades of gray and chrome, with a floor-to-ceiling window offering a panoramic view of the city. He stood before that window, looking down at the restless, unending flow of traffic, feeling a profound sense of detachment. He was no longer a participant in the life below. He was an observer, a strategist moving pieces on a board. Over the next 48 hours, he worked with a relentless, single-minded focus he usually reserved for a complex piece of marquetry. His phone, the new burner phone, became an extension of his will. He was in constant contact with Thorne's team, reviewing the evidence they were compiling from the laptop, a mountain of deceit that was even more damning than he had initially realized. He conferred with the forensic accountants as they traced the money trail from his business account. Through a series of small, regular PayPal transfers Eleanor had disguised as payments to design consultants and directly to the vendors for the penthouse furniture. He was no longer just a woodworker. He was the CEO of his own vengeance. The plan, in its final form, was a masterpiece of legal and psychological warfare, designed not just to defeat Eleanor, but to utterly dismantle her. It would happen in two phases. Phase 1 was the legal blitzkrieg, a court order to freeze their joint account, effective in 72 hours, and an official legally binding eviction notice to be served by a court-martial to the unauthorized occupants of the Tribeca penthouse. That was the hammer. But Phase 2, that was the art. It was Jack's own contribution, a piece of strategic cruelty so perfectly tailored to Eleanor's psyche that Thorne had laughed with genuine, predatory delight when Jack proposed it. He sat at the hotel room's large desk, the city lights glittering below him like a field of fallen stars, and began to compose an email. It was not to a lawyer or a banker. It was to a high-end graphic designer whose card he had once picked up at a gallery opening. He began to type, outlining his vision with the same meticulous detail he would use to describe the grain of a piece of rare wood or the precise curve of a cabriole leg. He was commissioning the design for an invitation, the first tangible piece of the stage set he was building for Eleanor's final, public humiliation. He was a carpenter, after all, and he was about to build a gallows. The confrontation he had been anticipating for days arrived not with a storm, but with the quiet, mundane click of the apartment door. Jack was sitting in the worn leather armchair he had reupholstered himself, the one Eleanor usually shoved into a corner, out of sight. He had returned to the apartment an hour earlier, a ghost visiting his own grave, the air thick with the cloying scent of her perfume and the ghosts of 1,000 bitter silences. He had been living in the sterile anonymity of the Soho Hotel suite, a command center from which he had marshaled the forces of his own quiet war. But he knew he had to be here for this final act of the old world. He needed to see her face when she delivered the blow she believed would be fatal. When she walked in, she didn't seem surprised to see him, only mildly annoyed, as if he were an inconvenient piece of furniture she had forgotten to move. Her face was a mask of cool, professional composure, but he could see the manic, triumphant glitter in her eyes. She carried a large, stiff manila envelope, holding it not like a piece of mail, but like a weapon. She placed her designer handbag on the kitchen counter with a sharp, definitive click and walked toward him, the sound of her heels on the Swedish hardwood floor like the ticking of a countdown clock. She didn't sit. She stood over him, a position of power, of dominance. "Jack," she began, her voice devoid of any emotion save for a faint, bored impatience. "We need to talk." He said nothing, just looked up at her, his face carefully arranged into a mask of weary confusion. a role he had been rehearsing in the mirror of his hotel room. "This isn't working," she continued, her words crisp and rehearsed. "It hasn't been working for a very long time. We want different things. I have a vision for my life, a trajectory, and you're content. And that's fine for you, but it's not fine for me anymore." She slid the envelope from her manicured fingers, letting it fall into his lap. The paper felt heavy, official, its sharp corners digging into his thigh. "These are divorce papers. My lawyer drew them up. I think you'll find the terms are very straightforward." He looked down at the envelope, then back up at her face, letting the silence stretch, playing his part to perfection. He watched her confidence swell in the vacuum of his response, her chin lifting with a new, sharper arrogance. She mistook his silence for shock, his stillness for the paralysis of a broken heart. She had no idea she was looking at a man who had already mourned, already grieved, and had moved on to the cold, clean calculus of retribution. She saw a carpenter she was about to discard, not the architect of her own imminent ruin. The faintest, cruelest hint of a smirk touched her lips as she looked down on him, her victory so close she could taste it. "Don't look so surprised, Jack," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "This has been over for a very long time." He didn't argue. He didn't rage or plead or ask the pointless, wounded questions of a betrayed husband. That man was gone, a casualty of the high-definition video and the cold-blooded spreadsheet he had discovered on her laptop. In his place was a quiet, patient observer, a man who now understood that his wife's cruelty was a tool, and he was about to watch her use it to meticulously engineer her own destruction. He reached for the envelope, the crinkle of the thick paper unnaturally loud in the silent room. He broke the seal and slid out the thick stack of documents. The top page read, in severe, bold letters, "Petition for dissolution of marriage." He didn't look at Eleanor, who was still standing over him, her arms crossed, radiating an almost visible aura of smug impatience. He could feel her eyes on him, watching for the first crack in his composure, the first tremor in his hand, the first tear. She would see none of it. He carried the papers to the small dining table, the one he had built for them in their first year of marriage from a salvaged piece of tiger maple, its surface now scarred with the faint rings of her overpriced wine glasses. He sat, the chair scraping softly against the floor, and began to read. The legal jargon was a dense, suffocating forest, but the meaning was brutally clear. It was a document of total annihilation. He saw the demand for alimony, calculated to the maximum allowable percentage of his modest, declared income. He saw the motion for an immediate and forced liquidation of his business assets, with a valuation of his company so insultingly low it was laughable, a figure she had clearly fabricated to maximize her own perceived share of the marital property. He saw a clause demanding half the value of his tools, his truck, even the raw lumber stacked in his workshop. It was a scorched earth campaign designed to leave him with nothing but sawdust and debt. He read every line, every subclause, not with the horror of a victim, but with the grim satisfaction of a prosecutor reading a signed confession. This document, this monument to her greed, was the final piece of evidence Marcus Thorne's team needed. Her signature was already on the last page, a flamboyant, confident scrawl. She had handed him the loaded gun, foolishly believing it was pointed at him. After a long, deliberate silence, he picked up the cheap ballpoint pen she had placed on top of the stack. The plastic felt flimsy and hollow in his hand. With a steady, unwavering stroke, he signed his name on the indicated line. He then neatly squared the stack of papers and slid them back across the maple tabletop toward her. Her exhalation was a soft, triumphant hiss of air, the sound of a predator whose prey had finally surrendered. "I'll have these filed in the morning," she said, her voice bright with victory. As she scooped up the papers, the legal instrument of his execution, she delivered what she believed would be the final, severing blow. "By the way, the lease on this apartment has always been in my name. I'll need you out by the 1st of the month." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it all was almost beautiful in its purity. She was not just divorcing him and stripping him of his assets. She was rendering him homeless, evicting him from the home his labor had paid for month after month, year after year. He looked around the sterile white box she had created, at the soulless furniture bought on credit, at the curated vignettes of a life that was a complete fiction, and he felt a profound sense of detachment. This was not his home. It hadn't been for a very long time. It was her stage, and the play was finally reaching its conclusion, though not the one she had written. He remained seated at the table, his hands resting on the warm, familiar wood. a stark contrast to the cold fury that was now a placid lake within him. He simply nodded, his passivity continuing to fuel her sense of absolute power. "Okay," he said, his voice a low, empty monotone. She seemed almost disappointed by his lack of a fight. She had clearly prepared for a battle, for tears and accusations, and his quiet resignation robbed her of the full, dramatic satisfaction she craved. To compensate, she decided to twist the knife one last time, to salt the wounds she believed she had inflicted. "I know this is hard to understand, Jack," she began, adopting a tone of feigned, condescending sympathy that was far more insulting than her open contempt. "But I have an opportunity, a chance to finally build the life I deserve, in a place that reflects my potential." She gestured vaguely, a sweeping motion that was meant to encompass a world of luxury far beyond the brick-faced buildings of Queens. She was talking about his penthouse, of course, and the life she planned to live there with Preston Sterling. She believed she was describing a future he could never give her, never even comprehend. The irony was so thick, so rich, it was almost intoxicating. "You should take your things," she continued, her voice becoming brisk and practical. "Especially that bed. It's far too big and rustic for my new place." She said the word rustic as if it were a communicable disease. The final insult, the casual dismissal of the 200 hours of love and labor he had carved into that black walnut headboard, didn't even register as pain anymore. It was just another data point, another line item in the long invoice of her treachery. He looked at her, at this stranger wearing his wife's face, a woman so blinded by her own reflection in the glittering world of wealth that she couldn't see the abyss opening up right at her feet. She saw a defeated man, a simple carpenter she had outgrown and outmaneuvered. She had no idea she was speaking to the sole beneficiary of the Elspeth Miller Irrevocable Trust, a man who could buy and sell her entire world with the stroke of a pen. "It's a shame, really," she said, her final parting shot delivered with a dismissive little shrug. "You could have been so much more if you'd only been willing to try." He didn't grace her final judgment with a response. Words were pointless now. The time for talking was over. The only language she would understand was the one Marcus Thorne was about to speak on his behalf. The brutal, unforgiving dialect of catastrophic financial and social ruin. He stood up from the maple table, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked past her, avoiding any contact, and went to the hall closet. She watched him, a faint, curious frown on her face, likely expecting him to start packing his life into cardboard boxes. Instead, he reached past his worn canvas work coat, past the olive drab backpack she so despised, and picked up the single small black duffel bag that was sitting on the floor. He had placed it there when he arrived, another small, calculated piece of stagecraft in this final performance. He slung the bag over his shoulder. It contained everything he needed: a change of clothes, his grandmother's journal, and Eleanor's laptop, the digital coffin in which her entire conspiracy was interred. He left the coat and the backpack behind, the discarded skin of the man she thought she had destroyed. They were props now, part of the set, physical evidence of the stagnant project she had so successfully jettisoned from her life. He walked to the apartment door, his hand closing around the cool, familiar brass of the knob. He didn't look back. He didn't offer a final goodbye. The only sound was the soft click of the latch as he pulled the door shut behind him, a sound that, to him, was not an ending, but the beginning. He took the stairs, not the elevator, the rhythmic slap of his shoes on the concrete steps a steady, calming beat. When he emerged from the building into the cool evening air of Queens, it felt like taking his first breath in a new world. The city lights seemed sharper, the air cleaner. He was free. He walked with a purpose, not away from something, but toward everything that was about to happen. He stopped at the corner, under the jaundiced glow of a streetlight, and pulled out the burner phone. He opened the banking app for his private account, the one now irrevocably linked to the vast resources of his grandmother's trust. With a few taps on the screen, he initiated a wire transfer, $5,000. He sent it not to one of his new, fortified accounts, but to the old, contaminated joint checking account he still shared with Eleanor. He knew Thorne's legal team had already put a freeze on it. She wouldn't be able to withdraw a single cent, but the transaction would still register. The automated alert would still flash across the screen of her phone. It was a final, brilliant piece of psychological warfare, a move designed to look like the desperate, pathetic act of a broken man trying to buy back a love that was already gone. He could almost picture the notification appearing on her screen, a flash of green numbers confirming the deposit, and he imagined the cruel, dismissive smile that would spread across her face as she saw it, never once suspecting that the money was not a white flag of surrender, but the final, irresistible bait that would ensure she walked proudly and confidently into the center of his perfectly laid trap. The party was in full swing, a symphony of clinking champagne flutes, sophisticated jazz, and the low, confident hum of money talking to money. The penthouse, his penthouse, was filled with the very people Eleanor had spent her life trying to emulate. Senior partners from her firm, their wives dripping in discreetly expensive jewelry, wealthy clients whose names she usually only spoke in hushed, reverent tones, and the entire board of directors of the real estate brokerage. They mingled under the soft, ambient lighting, admiring the breathtaking view of the Manhattan skyline, oblivious to the fact that they were standing on a beautifully decorated, 4,000 square foot battlefield. Jack moved through the crowd, a phantom in his own home, playing the part of the slightly awkward but gracious host. He had greeted them all at the door, shaking hands, accepting their perfunctory congratulations on the surprise anniversary party with a quiet, enigmatic smile. They looked at him with a thinly veiled curiosity, this simple carpenter who had somehow managed to acquire such a spectacular piece of real estate. They saw his simple, well-made suit and his calloused hands, and their minds filled with dismissive assumptions. He was a lottery winner, perhaps, or the beneficiary of a lucky, unforeseen inheritance. They saw him as an anomaly, a temporary curiosity in their world of polished surfaces and old money. He let them think it. Their condescension was a part of the trap, the social camouflage that made him invisible. He saw Eleanor the moment she arrived. She entered on Preston Sterling's arm, a vision of triumphant beauty in a stunning, blood-red dress that must have cost a month's rent. Her eyes swept the room, and for a fraction of a second, he saw a flicker of pure, unadulterated panic. Then, as she saw him, her host, standing by the champagne bar, her expression shifted. The panic was instantly replaced by a breathtaking, staggering arrogance. He saw the calculation in her eyes, the gears turning as she constructed a new narrative on the spot. He wasn't a threat. He was a spectacle. This wasn't a trap. It was a grand, pathetic gesture. She believed he had discovered the apartment, and in a desperate last-ditch effort to win her back, had thrown this lavish party to prove he could finally be the man she wanted. The sheer, magnificent ego of her assumption was more perfect than anything he could have planned. She detached herself from Preston's arm and began gliding through the room, her smile dazzling, accepting congratulations on her new home. Her confidence not just restored, but amplified into a blinding, glorious hubris. She was the queen in her new castle, and he was merely the court jester providing the entertainment. She had no idea that the eviction notice from his lawyer was already taped to the service entrance door, or that the joint account she had tried to access that morning had been frozen solid by a court order. She was blissfully, fatally unaware that she was not a queen, but a pawn in the final, brutal checkmate of a game she never even knew she was playing. If you are enjoying this story of betrayal and calculated justice, please like this video. It helps us bring you more stories like this. The moment had come. The jazz trio faded into a soft, expectant silence. Jack stepped onto a small, discreetly placed riser near the floor-to-ceiling windows, a champagne flute in his hand. A hush fell over the room as all eyes turned to him. He could feel Eleanor's gaze on him, a mixture of condescending amusement and impatience, eager for him to finish his little speech so she could get on with the main event of her evening, the public dismissal of her starter husband. He saw Preston Sterling standing near the back, looking smug and proprietary, a conqueror surveying his new territory. Jack tapped his glass lightly with a fingernail, the clear, ringing sound cutting through the last of the murmurs. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice calm and steady, carrying easily through the silent, cavernous space. "Thank you all for coming to celebrate what is, for me, a very, very special occasion." He paused, letting his eyes sweep the room before they came to rest on Eleanor. He gave her a small, sad smile that she would interpret as loving, but which was, in fact, a final, silent farewell to the woman he had once loved. "My wife, Eleanor, has always had impeccable taste. She has a vision for a certain kind of life, a beautiful life, and for years, I felt like I was the one holding her back from it." He saw a flicker of smug agreement in her eyes. He was playing his part perfectly. She always dreamed of a home like this, with a view like this, a place that truly reflected her spirit. He raised his glass higher. Thankfully, my grandmother, in her infinite wisdom, gave me the means to make that dream a reality when she left me this penthouse and her entire $75 million estate in her will. The number, dropped so casually into the silence, landed with the force of a physical blow. A collective, audible gasp rippled through the room. He watched Eleanor's perfect, dazzling smile not just falter, but completely curdle. The color drained from her face, her skin turning the color of her alabaster Italian sofa. The confusion, the shock, the dawning, horrific understanding. It was all there. A rapid, ugly cascade of emotions playing out across her features for everyone to see. He saw her eyes dart toward Preston, a wild, panicked look of a conspirator whose partner has just turned state's evidence. But Jack wasn't finished. He turned the full force of his quiet, calm gaze back on her, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more intimate, more confessional, ensuring every single person in that room leaned in to hear every last, devastating word. "But it seems my wife was one step ahead of me all along," he continued, his voice laced with a perfect, tragic irony. "She not only found the place before I even told her about it, but she also found a new partner to help her decorate it with. And, of course, to break it in with. Isn't that right, Preston?" On the last syllable of Preston's name, Jack pressed a small, discreet button in his pocket. On the vast, empty white wall behind him, a high-definition projector, which the guests had assumed was for some sentimental anniversary slideshow, whirred to life. It did not display smiling photos from their wedding or happy vacation snapshots. Instead, a series of crystal-clear, brutally intimate still images filled the wall, each one the size of a small car. They were screenshots from the hidden camera, captured with a clarity that left nothing to the imagination. The first image was of Eleanor and Preston, locked in a passionate embrace in the center of the master bedroom. The second was of them, laughing, falling onto the minimalist platform bed she had so coveted. The third, and the most damning, was a shot of them asleep in that same bed, Preston's arm draped possessively over her, the morning light streaming in through the windows. The silence in the penthouse was no longer just quiet. It was absolute, a crushing, suffocating vacuum. The air crackled with a mixture of shock, scandal, and the delicious, horrified thrill of witnessing a complete and total social cataclysm. Every eye in the room, the eyes of her bosses, her colleagues, her clients, her friends, was fixed on the humiliating tableau projected on the wall, and then, like a pack of wolves turning on a wounded member of the pack, they all turned to stare at Eleanor. Her face was a grotesque mask of horror, her mouth slightly agape, her skin a waxy, bloodless white. She looked from the images on the wall to Preston, her eyes pleading, begging for him to say something, to do something, to deny it. Preston Sterling, however, was a man whose entire existence was built on a foundation of calculated self-preservation. He looked at the incriminating photos, at the faces of the board of directors staring at him with undisguised disgust, at the vaporizing remnants of his career and his reputation, and he made a swift, brutal calculation. He looked at Eleanor, the woman he had been sleeping with in her husband's home, and his face became a mask of cold, dismissive contempt. "I have no idea what this is," he said, his voice loud and clear in the dead silence. "This woman is a junior assistant at my firm who has clearly become unstable. I'll have security escort her out." With that, he turned his back on her completely, abandoning her in the wreckage he had helped create, and began striding toward the door, desperate to escape the blast radius of his own detonated life. The humiliation was absolute. The betrayal was complete. In the space of 30 seconds, in front of everyone whose opinion she valued, Eleanor's carefully curated world had not just imploded. It had been utterly and irrevocably annihilated. The aftermath was swift and merciless. As Preston Sterling made his hasty, ignominious exit, a collective, scornful murmur swept through the room. The party was over. Guests began to leave in a hurry, their faces a mixture of pity, disgust, and a barely concealed, ravenous hunger for the gossip they were about to spread. They avoided looking at Eleanor, who stood frozen in the center of the room as if she had been turned to stone. The giant, humiliating images still glowing on the wall behind her. She was no longer a person to them. She was a scandal, a cautionary tale, a social pariah. The divorce, when it happened, was not a negotiation. It was a surrender. With the video evidence, the forensic accounting of her theft from the business accounts, and the signed NDA proving a conspiracy to commit fraud, Eleanor had no leverage. no legal ground to stand on. Marcus Thorne's legal team dismantled her case with surgical precision. The pre-signed divorce papers she had so proudly served him were shredded, replaced by a settlement that was as brutal as it was just. Since the entire $75 million inheritance, including the penthouse, was held securely in the irrevocable trust his grandmother had established, it was legally untouchable, completely shielded from any marital claim. She was entitled to nothing. She left the marriage with only the clothes on her back and a mountain of credit card debt she had amassed to maintain her facade of wealth. Fired from her job for gross ethical violations and her affair with a superior, and publicly abandoned by the man for whom she had risked everything, she was blacklisted in the cutthroat world of Manhattan real estate. No one would hire her. No one would even take her calls. The friends who had once flocked to her side, drawn to the glittering illusion of her life, vanished overnight. She was forced to sell the designer clothes and handbags, the last vestiges of her aspirational life, just to make enough money to secure a deposit on a tiny, dilapidated studio apartment in the Bronx, a world away from the glass towers of Tribeca. The clunky, rustic monstrosity of a bed that she had so despised, the one Jack had built with his own hands, was the only piece of furniture he had let her take. It barely fit in the cramped room, a constant, massive black walnut reminder of the quiet, honest love she had thrown away, and the handcrafted empire she had single-handedly destroyed, haunted by the ghost of a fortune she never even knew she had. Jack, on the other hand, found that justice was the foundation for a new beginning. He sold the tainted penthouse, the memories too toxic to keep, and invested a small fraction of the proceeds into his business. He moved his workshop from the rented garage in Queens to a sprawling, light-filled space in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Miller Custom Design was born. His work, once a niche craft, was now celebrated for its integrity, its artistry, and its soul. He became a celebrated designer, his pieces sought after by collectors who valued authenticity over ostentation. He found peace not in the vastness of his wealth, but in the familiar, honest scent of sawdust and the satisfaction of a perfectly executed dovetail joint. And one afternoon, while installing a custom library in a Soho art gallery, he met the owner, a woman with kind eyes and a genuine appreciation for the story the grain of the wood told. He found a new, quiet love, built not on ambition and illusion, but on a shared foundation of mutual respect and a love for things that were real, solid, and built to last. The true measure of wealth is never found in the cold, hard numbers of a bank statement, but in the quiet, unshakable integrity of one's character. A life built on a foundation of lies, no matter how beautifully decorated, is destined to collapse under its own weight. True value, like the finest wood, is something that grows stronger and more beautiful with time, honesty, and care. What do you think is the most valuable thing a person can build in their life? Let us know in the comments below. The party was a living, breathing organism of wealth, a symphony of clinking champagne flutes, the sophisticated murmur of conversations about capital gains and summer homes in the Hamptons, and the cool, understated melody of a live jazz trio tucked into a corner. The penthouse, his penthouse, was the perfect circulatory system for this creature, its vast, open spaces allowing the guests to flow like blood cells through its arteries, pausing at the champagne bar or congregating by the floor-to-ceiling windows to gaze at the glittering, godlike view of the Manhattan skyline. Jack moved through it all like a ghost, a phantom in his own home, playing the part of the slightly awkward but undeniably gracious host. He had greeted every one of them at the door, shaking hands that were soft and uncalloused, accepting their perfunctory, slightly confused congratulations on the surprise anniversary party with a quiet, enigmatic smile that gave nothing away. They looked at him, at his simple but perfectly tailored dark suit, at the undisguisable strength in his hands, and their minds churned with dismissive assumptions. He was a lottery winner, perhaps, a statistical anomaly who had stumbled into a world he didn't understand. They saw him as a temporary curiosity, a piece of rustic furniture that didn't quite fit the room's aesthetic, and he allowed them this illusion. Their condescension was a part of the trap, the social camouflage that rendered him invisible, just another part of the catering staff in their eyes. He saw Eleanor the moment she arrived, a full hour late, making an entrance designed for maximum impact. She was on Preston Sterling's arm, a vision of triumphant beauty in a stunning, blood-red dress that clung to her form like a second skin. Her eyes swept the room, and for a fraction of a second, a flicker of pure, unadulterated panic flashed across her face. the look of a burglar who has just walked into a room and found all the lights on. But then, as her gaze found him, standing calmly by the bar, her expression underwent a breathtaking transformation. The panic was instantly extinguished, replaced by a staggering, glorious arrogance. He could see the calculation in her eyes, the gears turning at lightning speed as she constructed a new, more satisfying narrative on the spot. He wasn't a threat. He was a spectacle. This wasn't a trap. It was the most grand, pathetic, and ultimately doomed romantic gesture she had ever witnessed. She believed in the magnificent cathedral of her own ego, that he had somehow discovered the apartment and, in a desperate, last-ditch effort to win her back, had thrown this lavish party to prove he could finally be the man she deserved. The sheer hubris of her assumption was more perfect than anything he could have possibly planned. She detached herself from Preston's arm, her smile dazzling and predatory, and began to glide through the room, accepting congratulations on her new home. Her confidence not just restored, but amplified into a blinding, fatal radiance. She was the queen in her new castle, and he was merely the court jester providing the evening's entertainment. A sad final performance before he was to be banished from the kingdom forever. She had no idea the eviction notice was already taped to the service entrance, or that the joint account had been frozen solid by a court order, or that she was not a queen at all, but a pawn being willingly moved into the final brutal checkmate of a game she never even knew she was playing. The moment had arrived. As if on some invisible cue, the jazz trio faded into a soft, expectant silence. Jack stepped onto a small, discreetly placed riser near the windows. A single, full champagne flute held loosely in his hand. A hush fell over the room, the sophisticated hum of conversation unraveling into a vacuum of silence so profound it felt like a pressure change. All eyes turned to him. He could feel Eleanor's gaze, a laser beam of condescending amusement and impatience, eager for him to finish his little speech so she could get on with the real business of the evening, the public execution of their marriage. He saw Preston Sterling standing near the back, looking smug and proprietary, a conqueror surveying his new territory, a faint, bored smile playing on his lips. Jack tapped the crystal flute lightly with a fingernail, the clear, ringing sound slicing through the silence like a shard of glass. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice calm and steady, carrying with an unexpected authority through the cavernous space. "Thank you all for coming. It means the world to me that you're here to celebrate what is, for me, a very, very special occasion." He paused, letting his eyes sweep the room, making brief, polite contact with the faces of Eleanor's bosses, her colleagues, her wealthiest clients, before his gaze finally came to rest on her. He offered her a small, sad smile, a carefully crafted expression that she would interpret as the loving, wounded look of a defeated man, but which was, in fact, a final, silent farewell to the ghost of the woman he had once loved. "My wife Eleanor," he said, his voice imbued with a perfect tragic sincerity, "has always had the most impeccable taste. She has a vision for a certain kind of life, a beautiful life, and for years, I've felt like I was the one holding her back from it." He saw a flicker of smug agreement in her eyes, a slight self-satisfied tilt of her chin. He was playing his part to perfection, feeding her ego, fattening the lamb for the slaughter. "She always dreamed of a home like this," he continued, gesturing to the opulent room, "with a view like this, a place that truly reflected her spirit." He raised his glass higher, a grand, theatrical gesture. "Thankfully, my grandmother, in her infinite wisdom and generosity, gave me the means to finally make that dream a reality when she left me this penthouse and her entire $75 million estate in her will." The number, dropped so casually, so cleanly into the dead silence, landed not like a word, but like a physical object, a wrecking ball crashing through the room's plate-glass facade of social decorum. A collective, audible gasp rippled through the crowd. He watched Eleanor's perfect, dazzling smile not just falter, but completely curdle, the muscles in her face seizing as if she'd been struck by lightning. The color drained from her cheeks, her skin turning the waxy, translucent color of her $12,000 alabaster sofa. The confusion, the shock, the dawning, horrific, world-ending understanding. It was all there, a rapid, ugly cascade of emotions playing out across her features for every single person in the room to witness. He saw her eyes dart wildly toward Preston, a panicked, pleading look of a conspirator whose partner has just turned state's evidence on the stand. If you are enjoying this story of betrayal and calculated justice, please like this video. It helps us bring you more stories like this. But Jack wasn't finished. He was a craftsman, and this moment was a piece of intricate, multi-layered joinery he had been designing for weeks. He turned the full force of his quiet, calm gaze back on Eleanor, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more intimate, more confessional, a tone that ensured every single person in that room leaned in, desperate to hear every last, devastating word. "But it seems my wife was one step ahead of me all along," he continued, his voice now laced with a perfect, tragic irony that was a razor blade wrapped in velvet. "She not only found this beautiful place before I even had a chance to tell her about it, but it appears she also found a new partner to help her decorate it with. And of course, to break it in with." He let that phrase hang in the toxic air for a beat, allowing the full, sordid implication to sink into the minds of her colleagues and clients. Then, he turned his head slightly, his eyes finding the smug, handsome face of Preston Sterling, which was now a mask of confusion and dawning alarm. "Isn't that right, Preston?" On the last sharp syllable of Preston's name, Jack pressed a small, discreet button in his pocket. On the vast, empty white wall behind him, a high-definition projector, which the guests had assumed was for some sentimental anniversary slideshow, whirred to life. It did not display smiling photos from their wedding. Instead, a series of crystal-clear, brutally intimate still images filled the wall, each one the size of a small car, captured with a clarity that left nothing to the imagination. The first image was of Eleanor and Preston, locked in a passionate embrace just inside the master bedroom. The second showed them laughing as they fell onto the minimalist platform bed she had so coveted. The third, and the most damning, was a shot of them asleep in that same bed, Preston's arm draped possessively over her, the morning light streaming in. The silence in the penthouse was no longer just quiet. It was a physical entity, a crushing, suffocating vacuum. Every eye in the room, the eyes of her bosses, her mentors, the firm's board of directors, was fixed on the humiliating tableau projected on the wall. And then, like a pack of wolves turning on a wounded member, they all turned to stare at Eleanor. Her face was a grotesque mask of horror, her mouth slightly agape, her skin a waxy, bloodless white. She looked from the images on the wall to Preston, her eyes pleading, begging for him to say something, to do something, to deny it, to save her. Preston Sterling, however, was a man whose entire existence was built on a foundation of calculated self-preservation. He looked at the incriminating photos, at the faces of his superiors staring at him with undisguised disgust, at the vaporizing remnants of his career, and he made a swift, brutal calculation. He looked at Eleanor, the junior assistant he had been sleeping with in her husband's home, and his face became a mask of cold, dismissive contempt. "I have no idea what this is," he said, his voice loud and clear in the dead silence. "This woman is clearly unstable. I'll have security escort her out." With that, he turned his back on her completely, abandoning her in the wreckage he had helped create, and began striding toward the door, a man desperately trying to outrun the blast radius of his own detonated life. The humiliation was absolute, the betrayal complete, and Eleanor was left standing alone in the center of the room, a social leper, bathed in the unforgiving glow of a truth she could no longer escape. The aftermath was not a storm, but a quiet, inexorable tide that washed away the wreckage of Eleanor's life, leaving nothing behind. Jack learned of its final, grim stages not through gossip or gleeful reports from his lawyers, but through a single, sterile piece of mail forwarded from their old address in Queens. It was a final notice of default from a high-interest credit card company, a demand for a sum that was, for the woman who now received it, as unattainable as the moon. He stood in the cavernous, light-drenched space of his new workshop in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, the letter a flimsy, pathetic ghost in his calloused hand. The air here was different, smelling not of a cramped, damp garage, but of possibility, of salt from the East River, of a dozen exotic woods, teak, mahogany, zebrawood, and the clean, sharp scent of the new, state-of-the-art German machinery he had purchased. Sunlight streamed through the massive 20-foot-high industrial windows, illuminating the fine, dancing particles of sawdust like a kind of sacred dust. This space, the flagship of the now thriving Miller custom design, was the physical manifestation of his grandmother's true legacy. It wasn't the money itself, but the freedom it provided. The freedom to build, to create, to be exactly who he was, without apology or compromise. He thought of Eleanor, a fleeting, detached image, He pictured her in the tiny Bronx studio his lawyer had mentioned in a final closing report. He imagined her surrounded by the ghosts of her ambition, the designer clothes sold for pennies on the dollar, the handbags pawned, the friends who no longer answered her calls. He imagined her sleeping in the magnificent black walnut bed, the one piece of their shared life he had insisted she take, its hand-carved vines and leaves a constant, mocking reminder of the authentic, handcrafted love she had deemed a clunky, rustic monstrosity. The bed, which had been the heart of their home, was now the tombstone of her future, a sarcophagus of squandered opportunity that barely fit in a room smaller than the walk-in closet of the penthouse she had so briefly and so disastrously occupied. There was no triumph in the thought, no vengeful satisfaction, only a profound and weary sadness for the sheer, pointless waste of it all. She had chased a price tag, and in doing so, had forfeited all value. She had curated a life for an audience that had abandoned her the moment the show was over, leaving her alone in the dark with nothing but the crushing weight of her own bad faith. He folded the letter, a final, sterile postscript to a dead chapter of his life, his thoughts turning not to the wreckage of the past, but to the warm, inviting scent of turpentine and linseed oil that now mingled with the faint, lingering aroma of the sandalwood perfume worn by the gallery owner who was scheduled to visit his workshop in an hour. Her name was Anna, and she entered the workshop not with the appraising, critical eye of a client, but with the quiet, reverent curiosity of a fellow creator. He watched as she moved through the space, her fingers tracing the smooth, oiled surface of a newly finished dining table, her gaze lingering on the intricate dovetail joints of a bookshelf he was crafting from reclaimed cherry wood. She didn't speak of trends or resale values. She spoke of the wood's story, of the life it had lived as a tree, of the new life he was giving it. She saw what he saw. She understood his language. He led her to a stack of raw lumber he had recently acquired, a magnificent burled slab of black walnut, its grain a chaotic, beautiful explosion of color and texture. He ran his hand over its rough, unfinished surface, the familiar feel of it a grounding force. "This piece," he said, his voice softer than he had intended, "has been waiting a long time for the right project." Anna stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the swirling patterns in the wood. "It's magnificent," she breathed, her voice filled with a genuine awe that felt like a balm on an old, forgotten wound. "It looks like it holds 1,000 secrets." In that moment, standing beside her in a shaft of afternoon sunlight, surrounded by the honest materials of his life's work, Jack felt a profound and final shift within him. He understood, with a clarity that was as pure and solid as the wood beneath his hand, the true nature of the inheritance his grandmother had left him. The $75 million was a tool, nothing more. It was a well-made chisel, a powerful saw, a means to an end. It had given him the power to clear away the rotten, compromised structure of his old life, to protect himself, to exact a terrible and necessary justice. But it could not build happiness. It could not create meaning. That was a different kind of work, a slower, more patient craft that could only be done with the right partner. He looked at Anna, at the way the light caught the intelligence in her eyes, at the genuine smile that touched her lips as she looked from the wood to him, and he felt the laying of a new foundation, a structure built not on the shifting sands of ambition and deceit, but on the bedrock of shared values and mutual respect. He watched her trace the grain of the wood, her touch a gentle benediction, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he had spent half his life building things for a woman who only understood their price, and he would spend the rest of it building a life with a woman who understood their worth. The true measure of wealth is never found in the cold, hard numbers of a bank statement, but in the quiet, unshakable integrity of one's character. A life built on a foundation of lies, no matter how beautifully decorated, is destined to collapse under its own weight. True value, like the finest wood, is something that grows stronger and more beautiful with time, honesty, and care. What do you think is the most valuable thing a person can build in their life? Let us know in the comments below.